Symphony No. 95 in C minor, second movement by Franz Joseph Haydn. Let's begin by taking a systematic look at each element of the title. We'll do the same that we did with the title of the Mozart Symphony earlier. We'll examine its genre, the significance of the number of the symphony itself, as well as the movement number. In terms of genre, this work is a symphony, and simply by knowing that, we already know that it was intended for concert use, that it was scored for orchestra, and that normally it would have 4 movements. The number of the symphony helps us to identify this work with its composer, because only one of the 3 composers in this unit wrote 100 plus symphonies. 95 is very close to 100, and neither of the other composers wrote anywhere near this number of symphonies, so it should be very easy for you to associate Symphony No. 95 with a composer who wrote 100 plus symphonies, Franz Joseph Haydn. We happen to be looking at the second movement of this symphony, and it just happens to be a theme and variations movement. In fact, if a composer does not choose to use sonata allegro format movement for the second movement of a 4-movement classical instrumental work, 9 times out of 10 he will choose theme and variations. That's why I think of it as typical second movement format. So here we are examining a work in its typical position within a classical multi-movement instrumental work. Now let's take a look at the listening outline for this composition that you have at hand. The first thing that you should notice about it is the names of each of the sections. These are given to you along the left-hand side of the table. And there are certainly no surprises here. It begins with a theme, it is followed by 3 variations, and it concludes with a coda. So there are no surprises here in terms of the types of sections that are represented in it. You expect to hear the main musical idea presented at the beginning in the theme section. You expect to hear varied repetitions of it presented in the variations that follow, and you also expect that the composer will do something to bring the work to a graceful conclusion. Now you also know that theme and variations movements are guided by the 2 opposing principles of identity and variety. And you would imagine that the composer would ensure that you are given a very clear presentation of the theme and that there would be regular references to it throughout the movement. You in fact do have this sort of thing. But the composer here plays with your expectations. In fact, Haydn is famous for doing these sorts of things. And what we will see here is a composer who is more or less breaking the rules for the entertainment of the audience. Basically, he's playing with your expectations. And I suppose that's what makes a work of this sort interesting. You expect to hear one thing at a certain point, and then suddenly you are confronted with something else. I know it's maddening for a music student, but in fact, as a person at a concert who's already acquired this knowledge, it actually is a lot of fun. And you will get to that point eventually. Although Haydn is careful to present the theme in a simple, orderly fashion, and if you take a look at the content of the theme, you see that it contains an A section and a B section, and that each of these sections is repeated exactly as it was presented the first time. You will notice that the 3 variations do not present it quite so simply. Now the first variation is perfectly regular. Notice it has an A section that is repeated, and it has a B section which is repeated as well. But if you take a look at variations 2 and 3, you will see that each of them has 3 sections in it, not 4. as the theme does and as the first variation does. Here, Haydn is playing with your expectations. You expect to hear the theme presented in 4 sections, and you hear it in the presentation of the theme at the beginning and in the first variation, but then after that he gives you only 3 sections in each one of the variations. In fact, the pattern that the composer has established in variations 2 and 3 makes you believe that the next variation should have only 3 sections to it. So at the end of variation 3, at the beginning of the coda, you imagine that you are beginning a 4th variation in the piece. And here the composer presents the theme very clearly and very simply. But he presents only one of the 4 typical sections of it that we heard in the first theme and then the first variation, and he immediately sets about bringing the work to an end. So although this is not the most regular example of a theme and variations movement, it is very much typical of Haydn, a composer who was known for his sense of humor. And speaking of sense of humor, Haydn deals rather cleverly with a situation that must have been a great annoyance to composers of the 18th century. The second movements of symphonies, usually cast in theme and variation format, are generally quiet and introspective. And in a court setting, where such concerts containing this kind of music were presented after long, elaborate dinners, members of the audience sometimes fell asleep during these movements. Well, Haydn had a way of dealing with this, and in fact, at the very end of the movement, he presents very, very loud harmonies played by the orchestra in contrast to the quiet movement that came before it. Indeed, one of his most famous compositions is called the Surprise Symphony, because in a theme and variation movement he does exactly this, but he does it at rather irregular intervals throughout the movement to keep the audience on its toes. So the loud harmonies that you hear on occasion are intended to wake the sleeping members of the audience.